The risk premium of France surpasses that of Greece because the French government is on the verge of collapsing due to its political inability to balance the accounts. Let's take a look. The government of France, led by Prime Minister Michel Barnier, appointed by the President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, is about to fall. And it is about to fall as a consequence of the financial ungovernability of the French state. In 2024, France's public deficit will exceed 6% of GDP, and its public debt will exceed 112% of GDP. In other words, the French state needs to strongly balance its public accounts, aligning its revenues and expenses. Many times, to balance the accounts, there are two options. One is to increase revenues, and the other is to cut expenses. Social Democrats generally prefer to balance the accounts by increasing revenues through more taxes, while we libertarians aim to balance the accounts with much less spending, not by raising taxes. But from a financial balance perspective, both strategies are potentially valid. What, however, is the problem with France? Well, France currently has the heaviest state, the largest state in the entire world. The weight of public spending compared to the gross domestic product in France is close to 60%. And of course, given that situation, it seems that the most reasonable way to balance the budget, even for social democrats like Macron, is primarily by cutting spending, not further increasing an already extremely burdensome taxation in France. But what happens? Well, the French government lacks a parliamentary majority to pass its budget. Let's remember that in the last legislative elections, the far left and the far right gained the majority of the deputies, and therefore, any budget that wants to be approved in the French National Assembly must either have the concurrence or the support of the far left, or the support of the far right, or if we do not like the labels of far left and far right, socialist left and nationalist right. And of course, both the socialist left and the nationalist right are strongly statist political movements, especially in France. It is true that in other countries there may be other nationalist right-wing groups that are not as statist as in France, but certainly in France, Le Pen's movement is deeply statist and state-centric. This means that neither the socialist left nor the nationalist right want to cut spending, or at least not in a significant way. Of course, both the socialist left and the nationalist right will claim they want to cut redundancies, waste, and superfluous expenses. But when it comes down to it, to balance the accounts so unbalanced that the deficit exceeds 6% of GDP, when it comes down to it, to balance such unbalanced accounts, you need to cut areas that neither the socialist left nor the nationalist right want to address. That's why both movements reject the budget proposal put forward by Prime Minister Barnier, where the majority of the adjustment is through spending cuts. Cutting 40 billion euros from the state budget, even while tax increases are also included. Because let's not forget that the entire French political spectrum is statist, including Barnier and Macron, of course. Tax increases amounting to 20 billion euros, meaning that 2/3 of the adjustment is through spending cuts and 1/3 through tax increases. But that adjustment of 2/3 of the spending is intolerable for the socialist left and the nationalist right. Therefore, if Barnier presents his budget proposal to the French Assembly, it will be rejected, it will not be approved. Does this mean that Barnier doesn't have the ability to approve the budget? No, it does not mean that. Constitutionally, Barnier has a tool that he ended up using to approve the budget. The French government can approve the state budget, let's say, by executive order. Now, if the state budget is approved by executive order, then the French Assembly can counteract. can respond to this government approval of the budget by executive order, with a motion of no confidence that, if Barnier loses, he is removed. And here, the uncertainty lay in whether, if Barnier approved the budget by decree, Le Pen would dare to join her votes with the far left to bring down Barnier's government. In other words, it was partly a game of poker. Barnier hoped to approve the budget by decree, expecting that at the last moment, Le Pen would back down and would not vote to censure the action of the government in the French National Assembly, consequently ousting this prime minister and his government. The Le Pen party has already announced that after the approval of the budget by decree, they will indeed censure Barnier's government. Therefore, if this happens, the prime minister will fall without that its budgets have been approved. What will be the consequence of all this then? Well, France will not have new budgets for 2025, and consequently, the ones for 2024 will be applied. The new prime minister will implement them, or will have to implement them, because Barnier will no longer be the prime minister. Macron will appoint this new prime minister, but, I repeat, they will not have new budgets with adjustments to balance the accounts in the year 2025. And here, of course, we encounter a major political economic problem that is already becoming visible in the evolution of the French risk premium, which today has once again surpassed the Greek risk premium. If there is no new budget, the public deficit for 2025 will be approximately 6% of the gross domestic product, the same as in 2024. That is to say, a public deficit that is not only very high, especially for a country already burdened with a public debt of 112% of the gross domestic product, but a public deficit that violates the European rules of budgetary stability. Let us remember that the Stability and Growth Pact establishes that member countries must have a public deficit of 3% of GDP or less, and if a member state, consistently has a public deficit greater than this 3% of GDP, an excessive deficit procedure will be initiated, which could ultimately lead to sanctioning that member state for failing to meet its deficit commitment. These European rules are back in effect from the year 2024, and that means if France does not reduce its public deficit, in 2025 Europe, the European Commission should open a file against the French state. But of course, this is a political conflict of the highest magnitude. France is the second largest economy in Europe and one of the states that clearly has significant influence in the European institutional structure. Will the European Commission dare to sanction France if it does not reduce its public deficit? If it does so, it risks that the anti-European movement within France, the Le Pen movement, and not just the Le Pen movement, but very clearly the Le Pen movement, still grows more. And therefore, there is a risk that before long, there could be a sort of French Brexit, an exit of France from the European Union and even from the euro. And if the European Commission does not sanction the French state after it clearly violates the Stability and Growth Pact, it will become very clear that this Stability and Growth Pact is meaningless, and it doesn't matter if the member states respect it or not. The European Commission will do nothing. And of course, if the various member states enter into a dynamic of public over-indebtedness, even more than they have to date, with the additional expectation that the European Central Bank will buy up the excess public debt. In many of these states, stabilizing their interest rates and therefore the cost of financing such enormous amounts of debt, then what will happen is that the euro will fall into disrepute. At the moment, it is already in clear depreciation against the dollar, but of course the discredit I'm referring to is much greater than this. And that loss of credibility, that drop in demand for euros because it is an unreliable currency to the extent that the issuing states of that currency are not financially reliable, that drop in demand for euros would necessarily lead to a resurgence of inflation. And more inflation means even greater public discontent. The need for the European Central Bank to raise interest rates to curb it. Higher interest rates mean a greater financial burden for the states that are over-indebted, as well as greater stagnation and contraction of European economies, and therefore, a political and economic chaos throughout the entire Eurozone, stemming from the fact that the member states of this single currency called the euro do not want to be financially responsible. Political crisis in Germany and political crisis in France. In other words, political crisis at the heart of the European Union and the Eurozone. Therefore, right now, the political and economic uncertainty around the European institutions and the euro are skyrocketing. The European institutions and the single currency are skyrocketing, and they are soaring because, within this institutional architecture, the different national political castes of the European Union have always relied on being able to sponge off their neighbors. I issue more debt than I should responsibly, with the expectation that others will pay for that debt, or that we all will, through inflation. And with such perverse incentives and such irresponsible national political elites, along with electorates so tilted towards statism, it is very difficult for this monetary union to function. Because the requirements for it to work are controlled public deficits, low levels of public debt relative to GDP, and free and flexible markets for the mobility of production factors, are largely absent as a result of the excessive government intervention applied by all European states to generate client networks fueled by excessive public spending financed with debt over their electorates. So, let's see how the European oligarchies manage to get out of the trap they've created and gotten themselves into.